Last month was Black History Month in the US. Black History Month was started in 1926 by an organisation founded by the historian G Woodson because he felt that the history of Africans was overlooked, ignored, and even suppressed by the writers of history textbooks and the teachers who used them. The reason why February was chosen is that it coincided with the birthdays of Frederick Douglass, a revolutionary leader in the abolitionist movement, and former US President Abraham Lincoln, who issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. Interestingly, Black History Month in the UK was started in 1987 by a Ghanaian man named Achiaba Adesebo. In the UK, Black History Month is observed in October. One reason for this is that it's near the beginning of the school year and was seen as a good opportunity to teach kids about their heritage after a replenishing summer holiday. Other reasons involve the cultural significance of October in Africa, as it's a period of harvest. We don't seem to spend as much time talking about Black British history in relation to the British Empire, which speaks to the larger issue of concealing or sanitizing history in general to retroactively make it seem like the actions of Western empires were beneficial to those who were colonized or enslaved or subjected to genocide, which may be why as recent as 2016, 43% of Britons thought the British Empire was a good thing. One reason why Britain's imperial past has slipped under the radar is because a lot of their actions took place outside of the motherland, in contrast to the US, which currently exists on the land that they stole from the indigenous population and the land they enslaved Africans on. Even though the British were heavily involved in slavery, it wasn't as visible in Great Britain. When Kenya was colonized, for example, the British had seized 4 million acres of fertile land from the Kenyans, in particular the Kikuyu, who are a nation with a very sophisticated communal society. The land was sold to 1,000 European families for a penny an acre. The Kikuyu were left with arid land that was difficult to farm on and were forced to labour on the land that used to belong to them for the British. During World War I and World War II, the Kenyans as well as hundreds of thousands of other Africans were compelled to fight for the West. After World War II, Kenyans assumed that their conditions would get better since they fought alongside the British. Considering the supposed reason why World War II was fought, to stop the Nazis committing genocide on Jewish people, their expectations of better conditions were certainly warranted, but things actually got worse. The frustration of the Kikuyu people led them to form the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, led by people like Dedan Kemathi, and they fought for their land back by attacking the British and those loyal to the colonizers. They expanded partly through their religious beliefs. They rallied the population behind their liberation struggle through the use of traditional oathing rituals, which were used to resolve conflicts and unite the people. Kemathi, in addition to being a fighter, was also considered a powerful spiritual leader who performed these rituals. The British referred to the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army as the Mau Mau, and claimed that the pacts they formed to strengthen their bonds were acts of witchcraft that induced a violent mental illness. The Kikuyu struggle prompted the British to declare a state of emergency in 1952 to deal with their quote-unquote uncivilized savagery, implementing a scorched earth approach by dropping 6 million bombs on the Kikuyu. Additionally, the British forced over 1 million of the Kikuyu into concentration camps. They were forced to work, they were starved, tortured, castrated, raped, and so on. During the resistance, the death toll ranged from the tens of thousands to over 100,000, and one of those deaths were carried out on Kemathi, who was captured, put on trial, and executed in 1957, 6 years before Kenya gained independence. To ensure that their genocidal efforts were swept under the rug, the British destroyed as many documents as they could find, which is why the extent of these atrocities is still so obscure. Within Great Britain around the same time, the government did everything they could to give off the impression that systemic racism didn't exist, especially after World War II. But concealing their racism became much harder with the arrival of the Windrush Generation in 1948. The Windrush Generation were people from the Caribbean who moved to Britain between 1948 and 1970, initially on a ship of the same name. They left in search of a better life after the war, as there were a lack of opportunities in the Caribbean. Many of them were skilled workers, ranging from engineers, machinists, gardeners, nurses, and more, and it was clear that Britain needed as many workers as possible to rebuild the nation. Despite these Caribbean people being British citizens, with the right to move to Britain, the government saw their migration as an incursion that had to be dealt with. In fact, they even considered diverting the route of the Empire Windrush ship to their colonies in East Africa, such as Kenya. The irony is that the British government were far more welcoming of those who fought against Britain, instead of the black people who fought with Britain. And knowing what they did to the Kenyans makes this rather unsurprising. Perhaps they bonded over their genocidal efforts. Behind closed doors, the government tried to stop Caribbean migration without being explicitly racist. In 1962, the government introduced a scheme to control black immigration, while still allowing white migrants to continue coming in. They did this by basing immigration on employment prospects with 3 categories: skilled, skilled/unskilled with a guaranteed job, or unskilled. This allowed them to disproportionately target black people, despite the vital labour they provided to the NHS, TfL, and the manufacturing sectors of the British economy. In 1968, Enoch Powell, the person who a few years earlier was begging Caribbean people to come and work in Great Britain, the land of milk and honey where the streets were paved with gold, did a U-turn and advocated to send them all back. These racist policies came to a head decades later when immigration laws changed again, leading to the Windrush Generation and their descendants being threatened with deportation if they couldn't provide an inconceivable amount of documents to prove that they were allowed to be in Britain. There were situations where people had left the country for a holiday or to go to a funeral and couldn't get back in. The government claims that this was a huge mistake, but judging by the history of how these laws came to be in the first place, it's clear that these mistakes are a product of the government failing to reconcile with its history of racism against non-white people. It was only a matter of time before anti-immigration rhetoric would rear its head as a scapegoat for a deteriorating system, springing the traps that were set decades earlier. Back in the 50s, racial tensions were continuing to be stoked, with people like Winston Churchill fanning the flames by suggesting to his colleagues that "Keep Britain White" would be a good campaign slogan in 1955. A few years later, in 1958, race riots broke out in Notting Hill, resulting in hundreds of white men taken to the streets, throwing firebombs at the houses of black residents. Instead of responding in kind, the Caribbean people decided to show white Britons the rich culture that they had brought with them. This took the form of an indoor carnival that was organised by Claudia Jones, who was exiled from the US for her communist beliefs. Her aim was to empower the black diaspora through cultural education and representation. The festival was a success and went on for several years until her unfortunate death in 1964. 2 years later, with heavy influences from Jones's festival, the Notting Hill Carnival was born, which has become one of the largest street festivals in the world.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City.
4 years after the first Notting Hill Carnival in the same area, the trial of the Mangrove 9 was about to make history. The Mangrove was an all-night restaurant that opened in March 1968, which was run by Frank Crichlow. At the time, Notting Hill was home to many of the Windrush Generation because accommodation was cheap. The Mangrove was the go-to place for black people in the area and was even visited by celebrities like Bob Marley, Jimi Hendrix, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, and more. Unsurprisingly, the restaurant was subjected to multiple raids. The police had claimed that a variety of illegal activities were taking place there, although no evidence was found to substantiate this. To make matters worse, the local council withdrew the Mangrove's license to operate all night, which put the restaurant under even more scrutiny. Due to his frustration, Frank sought out support from the local Caribbean community, as well as the British Black Panthers, who started their movement in 1968, after being inspired by the Black Panthers in the US and visits from Malcolm X and Kwame Ture in the 60s. The Panthers helped Crichlow organise a march against police harassment, which took place on August 9th, 1970. A pivotal moment in the march occurred when Black Panther Darcus Howe stood on the roof of a car and addressed the systemic oppression that they were dealing with.
It has been for some time now that black people have been caught up in complaining to police about police, complaining to magistrates about magistrates, complaining to judges about judges, complaining to politicians about politicians. We have become the own shapers of our destiny as from today. The precedents have been set. Young kids have committed the greatest revolutionary action that has been known in this country for some time. They walked into a police station and took it over, but the objective must be clear. The objective was to free their brothers. What our objective is today, what is going to continue to be, is a concerted, determined attempt to prevent any infringement on our rights.
There were around 150 protesters. In comparison, there were over 600 officers standing back and standing by. But they weren't standing by for long as fighting broke out between the police and the protesters. How the fighting started was unclear. Some say the police instigated it, others say it was some of the protesters. At the end of the day, 24 police officers had been injured and 19 protesters were arrested. 10 charges were dropped and the remaining 9 individuals, including Frank Crichlow, Claudia Jones and Darcus Howe, were charged with incitement to riot and affray and were tried at the Old Bailey, which is where the worst criminals went on trial. Darcus Howe and Claudia Jones took the bold decision to defend themselves, which meant that they could speak directly to the jury as opposed to going through a barrister. They also requested for an all-black jury due to the racial biases that white people had against black people, but that request was declined. After a lengthy trial, the Mangrove 9 were acquitted of all major charges. Arguably the deciding factor was Darcus's realization of a contradiction in the police's accusation that he instructed protesters to throw things at a police car.
Where did you see all of this? We were in an observation van. I said, bring the observation van. The lawyer said, Darcus, please, exhibits are two-edged sword. I said, I have nothing to lose. Bring the van. So they bring the van, and there were these slits at the back. There are 4 policemen seeing the same thing from the same slit. So I measured it quietly while the judge and they were wrong the side, and went home, cut out a piece of paper, foolscap, the size of the slit, recalled the witness, and said, tell me how 4 of you could see the same thing at the same time through that slit. He said, my eye was here, Reed's eye was here, Roger's eye was here, and the next eye was here. So it was your face. And that is what eventually broke the spirit of the prosecution.
At the end of the trial, the judge remarked that what this trial has shown is that there is clearly evidence of racial hatred on both sides. And although the protesters were clearly fighting against police harassment, this was the first acknowledgement of racism in the Metropolitan Police. In closing, we celebrate Black History Month, twice a year for some of us. People put #BLM in their bios and go to protest trying to get justice for black people. And although the public sentiment seems to be less overtly racist, it's still a big problem. Darcus Howe's speech in the Mangrove protest about systemic racism still rings true all these decades later. Those who fought alongside Britain in World War II, such as the Africans on and off the continent, as well as those who helped to rebuild the nation after the war, were still systemically targeted, and the same is the case today. Although the colonial period is officially ended, we're still victims of neo-colonialism, a process which is far more obscure than the blatant settler colonial domination. Black History Month can be wholesome, but for the other 10 or 11 months it gives people and the education system an excuse to ignore the achievements and struggles of Africans all over the world. Furthermore, it allows our curriculums to conveniently cherry-pick events that don't make the empire look as bad as it was. Everything that has been mentioned here is a part of world history and should be taught as such, considering how intertwined African history is with the development of Western civilization. Britain would have collapsed if it wasn't for the Windrush Generation, but I didn't learn about that in detail until I did my own research. And perhaps if it were taught properly, we would have known about the scandals that had been occurring long before the Windrush scandal had become mainstream in 2018. Finally, we should be focusing more of our attention on true liberation in the future, in addition to studying the past. Thanks as always for making it to the end of this video, and a special shout out to my top patrons Tovio Gand and the Christopher Hunter, as well as all the others who have been supporting this cause thus far. Some of you may be excited for this quick announcement, but I have started streaming on Twitch at twitch.tv/cybernetics. This means that I'll be able to put out way more content for you all in between the creation of these video essays, which always take longer than expected. Even though there is a slight pressure to get videos out in a faster manner. I do feel like the extra time that's spent reading and studying and talking to people results in a better video overall, so I can't guarantee any faster video essay uploads, but as I said, you can check me out on twitch.tv/sabernetics to see way more frequent uploads. And to put it in perspective, I believe my first stream that I did, which was around 1 hour and 45 minutes, is probably longer than all of my video essays combined, which is hilarious. So yeah, follow me there. I've also changed my Twitter handle finally after like a year to Cybernetics. I first spoke about changing the name over a year ago now. I just never really got around to it. I suppose the main reason is that it makes it just way more intelligible to read. But yeah, happy Black History Month. And as I said in the video, it should just be, you know, a wholesome month or two, depending on how many times you celebrate it. You know, it shouldn't be the end all be all of African history. So yeah, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you soon. Peace.